Hi, everyone. I'm Rachel Wolfson, the host and founder of Web3 Deep Dive Podcast. Web3 Deep Dive Podcast focuses on real-world Web3 use cases to help you better understand how Web3 is being applied today and how it may be leveraged in the future. If this sounds interesting, I encourage you to subscribe, like, and share the content that you're seeing today to help spread the word about Web3. Hey everyone, welcome back to Web3 Deep Dive Podcast. Today I'll be interviewing Kristen Hecht. She is the Deputy Chief Compliance and Global Money Laundering Reporting Officer at Binance. In today's interview, we're going to be talking all about compliance and regulations and how that looks for the Web3 and cryptocurrency sector. Before getting started with today's interview, I'd also like to take the time to thank House of Web3 and Edge & Node for letting us film today's interview in person in San Francisco at this beautiful podcasting space. So without further ado, let's get started with today's episode. Hey, Kristen, how's it going?
Hey, Rachel, it is going fabulously. I'm thrilled to be here to talk with you today. And also, it is a really gorgeous day here in San Francisco, so it makes it even better.
Yeah, it is a gorgeous day. And Kristen, I'm excited because, as you mentioned, we're here in person in San Francisco at the House of Web3, which is a beautiful space.
Yeah, it really is.
Yeah, and most of my interviews are remote now, so I'm super excited to be here with you in person.
Yes, so am I. And actually at Binance, we have a remote first work environment. And so this is really exciting to be here with you in person.
Yeah, it's like we're actually at an office.
Yes.
So Kristen, how did you get involved in the Web3 space?
Well, so it started about 3 years ago, and my first foray into Web3 was when I started at Meta, their crypto asset digital wallet project called Novi, formerly Calibra. I became the chief compliance officer there and had a lot of engagement with governments all over the world. After that project ended, I then moved into Binance, where I started at the company around the end of January of this year, and am now kind of became appointed as the Deputy Chief Compliance Officer and the Global Money Laundering Reporting Officer.
Right, and that is a long title, but I'm assuming, and we'll get to that in the questions, but I'm assuming you do a few things, and that's why you have a very long title, more than a few things.
Yes, that's absolutely right.
And Kristen, so it's Binance Global or Binance US that you're with?
Yeah, it is, great question. It is Binance Global.
Okay, got it. That's what I thought.
Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. And also it was interesting, I was reading about you and your background. You used to work with the U.S. Treasury?
I sure did, the U.S. Department of the Treasury for nearly a decade.
Wow, what were you doing there?
So I was a senior policy advisor in the Office of Terrorist Financing and Financial Crimes, where we were working on a range of national security issues, from implementing sanctions programs related to Iran, weapons of mass destruction, Somalia, et cetera, to working with our own regulators, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, which is the U.S. Financial Intelligence Unit, and also with the White House on national security policy strategy, and then also with international organizations like the Financial Action Task Force, which is, so there was quite a bit there that we were doing.
Wow, yeah, I mean, that's very relevant right now, but we can get into some questions later.
Great.
But that's impressive, so I'm really happy to be speaking with you today. So I guess the first question I'd like to know is just kind of explain your role at Binance. Like, what are you doing there?
Yeah, great question again. So as part of the Deputy Chief Compliance Officer role, I support, I think in large part, our entire team, but also Noah Perlman, who's our Chief Compliance Officer. So I help out with kind of the strategic vision of implementing the compliance program. And he and I both came in around the same time. And our goal is to kind of keep moving the program in the right direction, which it has been on. And there's been a lot of work that's been done over the last 2 years, but making sure that we have a consistent compliance program framework globally, as well as also to make sure we're having proactive engagement with policymakers and regulators.
Okay, wow. That's interesting. I can ask you like a million questions just based on what you said, but let's start off slow. When you say a global compliance framework, I mean, Binance is huge.
Yeah.
How is that being done today?
Yes. Well, we already have an existing global anti-money laundering policy, which is applied throughout all of Binance Global. whether it's, through our regulated or licensed or registered entities throughout the world. And the expectation is that this global, I'll call it AML from now on, policy, as well as our sanctions policy, making sure that it's embedded with our regional teams as well as our country level teams. And so it has to be applied across the board to ensure that we're adhering to baseline commitments for our own fairly strict and robust compliance standards, but also to local regulatory requirements anywhere we operate. So that's the foundational piece.
Okay. So with there being a lack of clarity around digital assets in the United States, how is that being achieved, I guess, to ensure compliance when there's not really a clear framework in the United States as of now? I mean, maybe it's easier in places like Europe, but what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first, we're not operating in the U.S., but, there are several of us who come from, the U.S. government, whether it's in law enforcement or policy and regulation. And then we also have a lot of folks from different regulators around the world. Many of us also have TradFi backgrounds as well. So we are kind of leveraging existing kind of best practices within the industry overall. And so that means, you want to have global standards. You want to have global AML policies that are applied everywhere. And for example, Binance is the only major exchange that does know your customer, kind of collecting IDs on every single client that we have throughout the globe.
Got it. And so in terms of compliance and regulations in regions like Europe or Asia, I mean, is it clear as to what needs to be done? Because, in the U.S., there's still a lot of gray, right?
Yeah.
But in other regions, would you say it's kind of clearer?
Yeah, I would say that there's a bit more clarity in other regions. Some countries tend to be a bit ahead of the game than other countries. And so there are definitely countries that have passed kind of digital asset or crypto legislation. You have, for example, MiCA, which is the Europe, kind of your EU-wide legislation that has been passed but has not yet gone into force.
So having things like that, does that make it easier for an exchange like Binance to operate and function?
Yeah, it does. It gives us a lot more clarity and a baseline in which to operate. I think it's also important to highlight that, part of our kind of global baseline minimum requirements and just best practices within the industry is to, for example, in sanctions, we apply several different sanctions regimes around the world, and these are global minimum requirements that we have. So we adhere to U.S. sanctions through the Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC. We adhere to the UK's, Her Majesty's Treasury sanctions. We adhere to Canada's sanctions list, the EU list, and then obviously the United Nations. And then whatever local requirements there might be in countries in which we operate and have actual entities established.
Okay.
Yeah.
Changing topics a little bit. So you come from a TradFi, traditional financial background, and now you're in the Web3 space, which we're actually kind of starting to see that shift happen more often, which is great. But how has that been helpful for you coming from traditional finance into Web3? And if so, how has that been helpful?
Actually, I think it's been really helpful quite a bit, and I've discussed this with a lot of colleagues and just, in my network as well. So there's a lot of similarities between TradFi and the Web3 space in that, especially if you're in compliance, you want to make sure that you're risk properly. And that means you have to know your customers, you have to know the client base. You also have to be assessing risk of the products. What are the inherent risks? What are the controls that are in place? And what's the residual risk? We also look at geographic risk. So those types of things apply, I think, across the board anywhere. We also think it's very important, and this is something that we're leveraging from TradFi, is making sure that we have appropriate governance in place, which includes having risk committee or compliance risk committees, whether we have them at the regional level, so they have proper escalation of issues or risks into a global compliance risk committee. So this is something that we've been establishing as we move forward. So there are a lot of parallels.
Yeah, that's interesting that there are a lot of parallels. And I think maybe just as the Web3 space advances, we're starting to see more parallels moving forward, as opposed to when I first entered the industry in 2017. I think it was still really like the wild, wild west. And now we're starting to see more clarity. I mean, even in the United States, like for the, the XRP case with Ripple, I mean, even that was a win. So I do think that we're starting to see more of that as we move forward versus like back in 2017.
Yes, yeah, fully agree with you. And I think it is going to take some time to get more clarity. And I think this is where, crypto, just generally in the Web3 space, just isn't yet well understood. And particularly within the policymaker and regulatory environment, I think they're definitely getting there, but there's a lot more work that we need to do within the industry to help, move kind of like, advance their knowledge moving forward. Because even in the crypto space, I mean, things are changing daily. So even working at Binance, the largest global exchange, I mean, there's so much activity going on, we're constantly having to educate ourselves as well.
Right.
But I think one crucial element that and this is what we convey every time we meet with a regulator or a policymaker, is that, we have robust compliance programs in place. I mean, this is not something we're willing to sacrifice. And so that's a message that we really want to get out to the public as well. We have the baseline minimum standards, we're very similar to TradFi. And I almost kind of feel like, given the very short amount of time it took for us to put it in place, because the company is only 6 years old, we've done a pretty incredible job doing that, especially within the last 2 years. Whereas TradFi companies, they've been around for decades, some over 100 years, and they're still evolving their compliance programs.
Definitely. So are you actually going and speaking with regulators in different regions and kind of educating them on what Binance is doing and educating them on what maybe you hope to see moving forward in terms of regulations with Web3?
Yeah, definitely. We do have, and this is kind of one of our big objectives, particularly this quarter and into the next year, is to have more proactive dialogue with key regulators around the world, as well as international organizations like the FATF, the Financial Action Task Force I mentioned, to help advance just knowledge generally. But yes, we have a number of licensed and registered entities globally, particularly in G7 countries, France, Spain, Japan, and so we regularly engage them and have these conversations.
Now, would you say regulators are interested and curious in learning about compliance when it comes to Web3 and crypto, or would you say that they're still very skeptical and they're like, okay, we've heard about this, but we're still like,
Yeah, no, I think that's great. So I think it really depends on the regulator, because a lot of them have, their different interests and kind of personalities as well, and regional interests. So I think that, can we start over?
Yeah.
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Sure. Okay. So that's all really interesting. I'm curious to know, are regulators interested in compliance when you go and you speak with them, or are they still kind of skeptical? And if they are interested, what are the questions they tend to ask? Or if they're skeptical, what are the questions they tend to ask?
Yeah, no, I think regulators, it depends on which one and which region and how engaged we've been with them previously. Some tend to be quite skeptical, some tend to be quite open and really interested. I think particularly in our licensed and registered jurisdictions, they're very interested in understanding the robustness of our compliance programs. So they already know that we have programs in place. They already know a bit of the business model. I think, if I recall, if they know us already, they want to understand what new products and services are coming out. How are we managing the risk just generally overall for what we currently have in place and offering to their, to our users in those jurisdictions. For regulators that are more skeptical, they definitely tend to focus on illicit activity that they see within the space. And something that's really interesting to point out, particularly for people who don't know much about crypto, is the blockchain is totally open and transparent. You can see every single movement on it. Whereas within TradFi, their ledgers are internal and you can't see it. So I find that to be one of the key areas that they hone in on. And then that leads us to providing them with more information about, the industry-leading vendors that we use to detect illicit financial activity on the blockchain, how we're managing it. Also go into our really robust law enforcement program, which relates to whether it's training, law enforcement agencies across the globe, or helping them with seizure requests and other types of issues. So that's kind of where I see how they're managing it and how we field it.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting time right now, and we don't have to go too much into it, but I'm just going to make a point here because I was reading an article this morning about, Hamas-linked crypto accounts and that cryptocurrency is being used to fund terrorist activities. And it's interesting because you made a point that's very important. Everything is transparent on a blockchain ledger. And so while some people are criticizing crypto now, some regulators are criticizing crypto now saying, it's being used by terrorists. What we really have to stress is that everything is transparent and open on a blockchain network. And we can see that activity. So that makes it a little bit more like, why would criminals want to use cryptocurrency? And I think that's actually a very important point to stress.
Yeah, fully agree with you. And again, I think kind of like, the devil's advocate here is like, pre-blockchain and pre-Web3, I mean, terrorists, criminal networks, WMD proliferators, they're using the traditional financial system as well, and they still continue to do that.
Right.
I would say the majority of illicit financial activity is happening within the traditional financial system and isn't very apparent. So, and again, like I said earlier, I think because the blockchain is so open and transparent, it's easier to track.
Right, exactly. And that's a really important point. And I know that within articles I've been reading, there are companies, I think it's Elliptical, they have data showing that actually a lot of the traditional media has been exaggerating how much cryptocurrency has been used towards terrorist funding. And it's actually a lot less based on data that you can actually see. And so I just think that's a really important and interesting point. Yeah. But changing topics, can we talk a little bit about, I know you mentioned Binance has programs in place and maybe even new initiatives coming up. I don't know if we already talked about any of that, but can you share with us like new initiatives that are being launched by Binance to ensure compliance? Anything specific?
Anything specific? So I think it's really important to highlight that, you have senior level commitment from the top, including CEO on down, to make sure that we have a very strong compliance program in place, including culture of compliance. This is evidenced by the fact that we have been hiring really talented personnel into key roles. Again, I think, I mentioned before, we have former U.S. government officials, former law enforcement from all over the world. So they're really looking at top talent to come in, make sure we're running the program and meeting regulatory expectations and requirements. Also, we've done just a lot of work generally in bringing in industry-leading third-party vendors, such as Elliptic, such as Chainalysis, such as a bunch of others that you would expect, for sanction screening, transaction monitoring, et cetera. And again, we have a commitment now that we're going to be spending even more in the compliance program than we did last year. I would say it's approximately 50 million more than we did last year.
Wow. Yeah, no, that's great. And that's what, as the Web3 space matures and as the crypto space matures and advances, we need compliance and we need, exchanges like Binance to heavily invest and kind of help shape how this space is going to look moving forward. Going back to the XRP case with Ripple, I mean, that is something that will help, that small victory will help shape the space moving forward, especially in the United States, I think. I mean, we're not there, but things like that, companies really ramping up and doing due diligence and taking the time to fight for compliance and rights and education is really important.
Yeah, fully agree. And actually, we're striving to, and our objective is, and I think we believe we already have this, we have the industry-leading compliance program, throughout the world. And that's really important for us to maintain that and the direction that we'll be going. Mm-hmm. I think something else that's really interesting, too, our law enforcement assistance program, we've we've handled roughly around, I think it's give or take 40,000 requests from law enforcement agencies around the world. I mean, that's, a significant number of requests that our team handles. We have really sophisticated personnel there too who have, really interesting investigations backgrounds. We have complex investigators. They're helping triage and support our, country level staff when they have to submit suspicious activity reports to regulators.
Mm-hmm. Now, you're also, is it the money laundering report officer. Did I get that right?
Yes, the global money laundering reporting officer.
Okay,
yes.
Thank you. So now does all of everything that we were just talking about, does all of that also fall under that category, or are you doing something different with that role?
I think a lot of what I was talking about, some of it falls under that category. And I think, the point or aim of that role is to really provide, I think, the executive support to our regional compliance officers as well as our country money laundering reporting officers to ensure that they have what they need to comply with local regulatory requirements and expectations. And again, that kind of goes back to ensuring that we're identifying the risks of the client base that we have there, properly risk rating the products and services, and helping support them within the conversations they're having with their regulators within their jurisdiction. And again, that goes back to what I mentioned about having a kind of global anti-money laundering and sanctions kind of policy and programmatic framework that is consistent across the board. So we're applying the same foundational elements to all of our user base, and then also ensuring that whatever they need is captured. If there's additional regulatory requirements, that we're making sure it's captured and then integrated and embedded into our systems.
Mm-hmm. So out of curiosity, in terms of what you find most interesting and most urgent in terms of compliance and even with the money laundering aspect, what would that be? Like, what do you think that exchanges like Binance should be focused heavily on right now?
I think probably our biggest priority right now is really understanding the very dynamic and fast-moving regulatory environment. That is something that I think the entire crypto industry is dealing with because there's, many of the regulators we work with, although some are quite savvy and have some personnel who do have some expertise, I think more broadly they don't. So it's being able to interpret some of the legislation actually that is in place, like, what do they mean by privacy coins? What do they mean by this? And making sure that we're doing the appropriate risk assessments, understanding that we have, the right compliance controls in place, and then, having those dialogues with them to make sure that they understand, the risk that we're managing, how we feel comfortable with it, and then to make sure it's something that's within their appetite as well.
Mm-hmm. Did you want to add anything? Maybe I didn't ask you a particular question that you just want to point out to our listeners?
Yeah, I think, again, I probably emphasized this several times, is, it's really important to have proactive regulatory and policymaker engagement. I think that is the key to success for the entire crypto industry. We need to be working together to ensure that we're educating them on the technology, on how crypto works generally, on how assets move, why they move, the type of users that are on the platform, as well as the differences, subtle nuances between how, the TradFi kind of fund movements might differ from, the way crypto assets are moved. So I think definitely those are areas that we need to come together on.
Yeah, and I do think that mass adoption with cryptocurrency and the use of blockchain technology is possible, but I think there's still a lot of confusion. So people like my mom, for instance, she's familiar with traditional finance, but she doesn't, she may not know how to buy Bitcoin. And then if she has the Bitcoin, where to store the Bitcoin, and then how to sell the Bitcoin and put it into her bank account. And so I think that this is also holding people back from entering the space just because they're so familiar with traditional finance. It's mm-hmm. easy, right? It's like, mm-hmm. Let me just, transfer money into my bank, and if I have an issue, I call the bank and they help me. But I think with crypto, it's still, unclear for a lot of people. It's just, they're stuck on traditional finance.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think also I think a lot of the companies out there, and particularly Binance, who's extremely user-focused and like that, it's a user-obsessed company.
Yeah.
They are continually refining and their products and features and services to make sure that it is simplified, to make sure that they can bring on people who may never have used it, because part of the company's, the values and the mission is to serve people globally so they have the freedom to access, funds and assets. So that is really kind of a core commitment of the company.
Definitely. I mean, I remember when I was in Paris, I was meeting with your team in Paris, and David, who is the president of Binance France,
Binance France.
Yeah. He showed me a debit card, and you can actually use that to spend the crypto that you have in your Binance wallet. Is that correct?
Yes.
But I was like, oh, wow, that's awesome. But obviously, I'm based in the United States, so I unfortunately cannot use that debit card. But I guess people in Europe in other regions have access to a debit card, which makes it very easy to get crypto and then to spend that if they choose.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's very exciting. And I think that goes back to one of the, just kind of innovations and then the way we're simplifying products to make it more accessible and just, have people be able to understand it and they can bridge their knowledge from the TradFi sector into crypto and see how easy it can be.
Right. Another topic I wanted to touch on before we end this interview is women in the space, because,
Yes.
we're both women, and I know Binance has a lot of women that work with the company and work for the company. And so what are your thoughts on just getting more women into Web3?
Yeah, no, absolutely. That is a great question. Binance is very dedicated to making sure that we have a large number of females within the company. I work with many of them on a daily basis. And I think it's also interesting to highlight, too, one of our co-founders is female. And we also have around 35% of the senior leadership and managers within Binance are female. And so I think that's absolutely crucial. Other things that we're doing, and I think that would be great for the industry to follow suit, is giving scholarships out for women to enhance their education within the sector. And then something else I think is really critical, and this is a best practice I brought in from previous work, is when you're working with recruiters to hire people for roles, you need to go the extra mile to make sure that you're looking not just for male candidates, but that you're pulling in female candidates who are qualified as well. And it does take more time. And that's just something that I think all of us should be doing as a best practice. Another thing too, probably goes without saying, but good to reiterate, is just networking. Giving younger women and even, women, who are professionals and might be afraid of the industry, coming into fintech, coming into crypto, giving them the confidence that, this is actually a really exciting space. You do have useful skill sets to come in. And it isn't just in the tech and engineering space. You have compliance, you have legal, you have finance, you have everything that you would have at a typical business. And so there are a lot of skill sets you can bring in while you're learning on the job too.
Definitely. And I don't know, but Binance is probably hiring because I feel like Binance is growing every single day. So if any of the listeners are women listening to this, they should definitely reach out and say, hey, I'm interested in learning more, and maybe they could find a career in Web3.
Yeah, no, absolutely. We would love that and would love to have them reach out.
Wonderful. So, Kristen, anything else you want to add before we end the interview, or did we cover everything?
I would love to add, again, that I think it's, just reiterating this point, proactive regulatory engagement is key. Proactive, policymaker engagement is key, because obviously there's a lot of work to do globally. Something else I want to emphasize, too, is that Binance is fully committed to protecting its users. And, when this follows, again, with the user, being obsessed with our users and making sure that, we're dedicated to them, while also making sure we're adhering to regulatory expectations and requirements. Something that is really important to me and is also a priority that I'm working on is working with the different business teams within Binance to demonstrate how compliance is a business enabler. Because when you're working with key clients as well as regulators, really clients want to see that you have a robust compliance program in place. And that's really crucial. And I think that's in the long term, it'll pay dividends for the company. Right.
Before we end, just one follow-up on that, a robust compliance program in place. Any advice for anyone listening and they're thinking like, I want to enter the space, or, maybe start an exchange. how would one go about even having a robust compliance program? Do they need to hire someone like you to kind of build that out?
Yeah, I think, it really depends on the size. If they're starting at the very beginning, I think you definitely want to be researching it. You want to understand what the key components of a compliance program are. For example, the way we're set up, we have, we have different compliance program pillars. Know your customer, know your business. We also have a dedicated high-risk client team, which is extremely important to regulators. We have an entire screening and surveillance team, which also includes transaction monitoring. So we're looking across the spectrum of potential suspicious activity. And in the screening space, in particular for sanction screening, we're looking for potentially prohibited activity or any kind of potential nexus to it so we can move it off the platform. We have a full investigations team, that really is interfacing with law enforcement. as well as just investigating cases to make sure that our money laundering reporting officers on the ground have cases that they need in case there is suspicious activity.
Yeah, it's so interesting because there really is, just listening to you and what you just said, there really is a lot of traditional financial aspects moving into the crypto space. And personally, I think it's great because I think the only way we're going to have mass adoption of Web3, cryptocurrency, blockchain is through compliance and making sure everyone plays by the rules. I don't, I know a lot of people would probably disagree with me because, cryptocurrency also has other benefits, but I do think that that's a way to mass adoption.
Yeah, I fully agree as well. And I think once you have, a pretty strong compliance program in place, like I said, it pays dividends with investors, with, key clients, and then with the regulators. And then you have more of that and you're building trust, which is absolutely crucial to being able to scale and then have mass adoption.
Right.
If you don't have the trust, then you're not going to be able to operate places. And that's where companies really struggle.
Right. And I feel like that's, unfortunately kind of where the United States stands right now because of what's happened lately. There's now a lack of trust, which has set us back in the United States behind other regions. But that's a conversation for someone else in a different episode, and I'm sure I will talk about that with another guest. Kristen, it's been wonderful chatting with you. If our listeners want to get in touch with you, do you use Twitter, or are you on LinkedIn, or should they just follow Binance on Twitter? How can they get in touch with you?
I think the best is I'm definitely on LinkedIn, so you can look up my profile there, and also just follow Binance Twitter. You can reach out to me there, and really look forward to engaging with you and the audience.
Yeah, great. Well, thanks, Kristen.
Thank you, Rachel.
Thanks. Special thanks to Aaron Bender for producing Web3 Deep Dive podcast. I'd also like to thank the sponsors behind Web3 Deep Dive. Finally, thanks to the listeners for tuning in. Please be sure to subscribe, like, and share. I'll see you guys next time.